It was several years ago when I discovered that the least expensive but the most desired gift on my nephew's Christmas wish list was a G.I. Joe Tiger Force helicopter. Least expensive, most desired. I signed up to be a hero uncle for a Christmas. And when he opened that gift, he was so excited. He brought the box over to me. And as we lifted the lid, that's when we discovered it was full of pieces. I didn't know it didn't come pre-assembled. Some of you are going, oh yeah, I'm not that guy. I'm pulling the instruction sheet out and I begin unfolding the instruction sheet. And as I do, I'm looking at all these words. I read instruction 1, 2, but I hear a couple little hands underneath this piece of paper moving. And I tried to caution him that he probably didn't know what he was doing, but as I looked down, he's like at steps 7, 8, and 9. And I said, have you done this before? And he said, nope. I'm completely confused. I read 15, 16, 17. He's on 21, 22, 23. I turned to my sister, and from the instruction sheet, I just lowered it and said, psst, we may have a genius in the family. I'm just all jazzed up. I mean, this is extraordinary. When all of a sudden I heard, as I kept reading ahead of him, and he was so quickly moving with accuracy, I finally heard laughing in the room. And I lowered the instruction sheet, and one relative yelled, Dwight, look at what he's looking at on the other side of all those words you're reading. Does anybody know what he might have been looking at on the other side of the sheet? Yes, there was a picture with arrows pointing to how it all came together. No wonder he was doing this with such speed and with such accuracy. It's always easier when you have a pictorial model. No wonder Hebrews 12:2 tells us that we get to fix our eyes on Jesus, our pictorial model to follow. Many of us have wanted to lead high-impact lives. I know I was born that way, but I will tell you that my parents got the kind of kid that every parent hopes and prays they'll never get. I was the kind of kid that got nicknamed Dwight the Fright. I left a negative energy trail behind my life most occasions, and so I can remember living with this deep desire, but I couldn't figure it out. How many of us in this room, you would confess with me that in spite of the fact you might not have figured it out yet, you really don't want to become extinct without significance. You want your life to make a difference. You want somehow for your life to have mattered. How many of us in the room, I'm going to put both hands up, you want your life to make an impact? Hands up, hands up. You know what? It's close to 100%. I want to encourage you. The reason you want that is you were hardwired by your master creator with that desire. Because he says through his prophet Jeremiah 29:11, he said, I know the plans I have for you. And they're plans to give you a hope and a future. Wow. But how? How do I lead that high impact life? How many of us, when we've wanted to learn how to do something, ladies, whether it's a new recipe that you're trying to figure out, or men, it's a mechanical issue and you're trying to figure it out in your car, or maybe it's a new sport we're trying to learn. How many of us have visited the world's #2 most well-used website? We've gone to YouTube to figure out how to do something. Come on, hands up. You've gone to YouTube to figure out how to do something? Well, your Creator knows us so well. He knew that for all humanity, not only would a pictorial model, but actually if we could have one that was in the flesh moving among us. So he sent us John, who got to get his eyes fixed on Jesus. John tells us in John 1:14, he said, the Word, Christ, became flesh and lived among us. He's on the move. He's a YouTube model to follow. And we actually get to get eyes on, John said, and see his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father. We get to see what a life full of grace and truth looks like. Wow. And then they gave us the advantages as first generation kingdom laborers of what they saw when they got eyes on Jesus. We don't have to wonder. I love reading in Luke's account when he tells us about one of the guys who got eyes on Jesus. He was just at work cleaning up after work one day. He was cleaning up when all of a sudden there's a set of feet there. And as he followed those feet up, it's Jesus at his workplace. And Jesus said, hey, Peter, you want to go in your boat? Let's go out on the lake together. They got out on the lake and some really cool stuff started happening. Things Peter had never seen, and he's feeling so overwhelmed, he just fell at Jesus' knees on the boat and said, you might not want to be with a guy like me. I'm a sinner. I was eyes on when I was reading what was Peter's firsthand experience. And do you know what Jesus did in that moment? Understanding you and understanding me, Dwight the Fright, I looked and I realized he would say this to you, he'd say it to me. He looked at Peter and said, Peter, let's you and I spend time together. He didn't point a bony accusing finger at Peter. He said, let's you and I spend time together. Why don't you come hang out with me? Why don't you get eyes on and you come follow me and I'll show you how to lead a high impact life. No wonder Scripture tells us, fix your eyes on Jesus. And what did Peter, what did John, who tells you what they see, what did they see? What did they learn from Jesus when they got eyes on? Well, the first thing they want you to know is that Jesus didn't model for them an upfront plan. These were regular guys. And so they took note of the fact that when they started following him, he wasn't modeling for them how to be upfront speakers. That wasn't a prerequisite. He wasn't trying to teach them how to be upfront. He wasn't teaching them an upfront plan. He was teaching them an up-close plan. Can I ask you a question right now? Because you thought that was a safe seat, and suddenly it's not as safe as it was. Can I ask you something? Does this feel slightly more impactful than when I was standing up there? Yes. He's saying yes. Do you know, for some of us who would be afraid to become public speakers, in fact, how many of you avoided that class at school? You didn't want to take public speaking. How many of you are hoping I'm not headed your way to play tag and you're on for the next 20 minutes? They say for many people, the fear of public speaking is a worse fear than death. He wasn't teaching them, if they wanted to lead high impact lives, how to get up front. He was Emmanuel. Matthew, who followed Jesus, said, the virgin shall conceive and she'll give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel. What does Emmanuel mean? Emmanuel means God what? God with us. It means what? God with us. Not God up front. It means God with us at our meal tables. God with us on our boats. God with us up close, not up front. They kept watching him. One day, Jesus was asked a question by somebody. Where is this kingdom you keep talking about? Where is it? Where everything is as it should be, and the love and the grace and the truth of God is in that place. And he said, watch my hand. He said, the kingdom of God is at hand. It's arm's length. It's eye to eye. It's heart to heart. It's up close. How many of you, the people who've impacted your life the most, were people who did up close with you? They did life with you. They were in the trenches with you. Jesus was showing them who would be maybe afraid of a stage. He showed them, man, if you want to lead a high impact life, you may impress from a distance, but you impact up close. For many of you right now, this is feeling more impactful. What he was modeling for them is impact happens up close. But then as they kept watching, Jesus among them, he was among them, teaching them, this is where it happens. They realized that he not only was modeling an up-close plan, he wasn't modeling a main stage plan, because many of us have such confidence in what happens on a stage, because those are the impressively gifted, the extraordinarily talented. We've got an extraordinarily talented pastor and the highly educated. And so they were regular guys who were thinking, what's our role? Like, we're not those people. We don't have those gifts. Jesus wasn't teaching them how to do main stage. He was teaching them mainstream ministry. Jesus was validating that mainstream people in mainstream vocations, like the one that he'd learned from his earthly father, Joseph. He wasn't born into a ruling class. He wasn't born into a political leadership family or a rabbinical leadership family. His dad was a builder in a little town called Nazareth. And Jesus learned the trade from his earthly father, Jesus. Some of us who are tradesmen, or you work a mainstream vocation, He would say to you, listen, I didn't start being full of grace and truth when I was 30 and began my public ministry. I was always, what do carpenters do? We know Jesus was a carpenter. What do? They go into people's houses to fix things. They might build things, repair things up close in the mainstreams. And Jesus, having experienced the power of being up close to people because he had an up-close vocation, validated that God's plan A was to engage people everywhere, every day, with the love and truth and grace of God in mainstream locations. So he starts picking people because he really wants to spread this everywhere. Hey, James and John, you're running a small business. I could use a couple small business owners. Peter, you're a fisherman. You know the fishing industry, and you know a lot of guys that are doing that. You know a lot of people around Galilee. I could use a guy like you. Matthew, you're an accountant. I could use an accountant. You work for IRS collecting taxes. I could use a guy like you. All of them, not one of them, was a graduate of a leading rabbi training school. They were all mainstream people. Come on. They were mainstream people. And then he took them out into mainstream locations. Eventually, Peter would tell a group of people he was telling in the book of Acts, chapter 10, 38, he said, listen, Jesus went around. He was moving. He went around doing good. He didn't require people because he understood that if we were going to reach all humanity, he understood that if the requirement was that they had to go to First Synagogue on Straight Street in Jerusalem, they might not show up inside the four walls of a building. So he was on the move, Peter said. He went around. Why? Because his plan was a mobile ministry plan. Look down at your feet. Your feet are moving all week long. This was the plan. And these guys who were going to go out in the mainstreams of life, they were going to learn this plan from him, that every time your feet move, your ministry neighborhood and opportunity changes and moves. So it was a wonderful thing for them to begin to discover what Jesus was trying to teach them, that buildings don't have feet. People do. People do. Look at your feet. That gives you great opportunity because every time you're moving, you have the opportunity to live out his mobile ministry plan. No wonder Romans 10:15 jubilantly says, how beautiful are the feet of those that bring good news. When you're moving, he gets excited because he's seeing all the people that are on his heart and mind, and you're moving ever closer. I can remember one night, I got home a little late from work, so late that I raced up the steps to make sure that my son wasn't asleep yet. I wanted to see him and find out about his day. And that's when he looked over at me as he said, Dad, I got called to the principal's office today. Oh no, people used to tell me, hey, Dwight the Fry, you just wait, you'll get kids just like you. That's the way God gets even with people like you. But I didn't have those kind of kids. I had great kids. My son and daughter were amazing. So in my head, I'm kind of going ballistic, like, oh my word, my son was in the principal's. What was that about? You know, and I'm trying to stay calm, like what would the Christian psychologist, Dr. James Dobson, say you do in a moment like this? And then I was kind of proud of myself. I said, well, tell me about it. He said, well, Dad, I was really nervous. I was sweating, Dad. And I said, well, I'm sure you were. Who else was in there? I'm thinking it's somebody else. He said, nobody. It was just me. And I'm thinking, what? He said, she asked what you do for a living. And when I told her, she said, what's that? And I told her, like, when you teach that laborer's L, like to be a kingdom laborer every day, you know, I told her that to love God is what Jesus said mattered most. When you love God with all your everything, that's everywhere your feet go, then he goes, you know. So when you're loving God with all your everything, he's like being transmitted through you every day, everywhere. And then I told her that the other part of the L is just this, like this, that you love the person you're near in any given moment as you love yourself, that's your neighbor. So every time your feet move, your neighbor changes. So it was a mainstream plan that he was relating to his teacher. He said, so Dad, I told her you teach people how to love God more and love other people better. I said, son, that's really good. He said, Dad, she told me that's the problem. She told me I'm not supposed to do that on the recess, and I'm not supposed to do that in our cafeteria or in our classroom. She actually told me, Dad, I'm not supposed to do it in our neighborhood or inside a park. She said only inside our house or inside the walls of a church building, and she's the boss of the school. And I said, well, son, are you an American citizen? He said, Dad, what's that have to do with what I just told you? I said, well, I don't know, you know, The last time I checked, we have something called freedom of religion and freedom of speech. I didn't want him to try to live some other plan. I want him to know Jesus' plan. And Jesus' plan was a mainstream plan, and it's based on the truth and reality of Psalm 24 that tells us in verse 1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The whole world and all the people who live in it. God's domain, his place of occupation, his place where Jesus taught mainstream ministry was everywhere your feet go. They were learning from Jesus. He was modeling it up close in the mainstreams, but they also were shocked by something else they learned from him. Most of us think when we want to lead a high impact life that we would have to be able to either be in front of a lot of people or we'd have to be like a viral influencer, something. We'd have to have lots of people. But what they learned from Jesus was he modeled one life at a time. As they kept eyes on watching him, yes, he spoke to a couple large crowds we'd call multitudes, but most of the time, their record for us is that they would see him one life after another after another. He would just pause for that life. What was he trying to teach them? Well, he's trying to teach them a business principle, actually. If some of you are business people or you're mathematic or financial, you know that Jesus was trying to introduce them to the power of one, the value of one. In business circles, we would call it compounding growth or exponential growth. He was trying to teach them it's never just one. He told a story once about 99 sheep and there was one that was missing. The shepherd went looking for that one because each one matters. I remember when Dwight the Fright would get dropped off at my grandmother's house because my parents, who were in first service, 90 and 93 years of age, when they deserved a break, they'd drop me off at a loving grandma's. Grandmas will take on anything. And I can remember she would always have an idea for focusing my energy. So on one occasion, she dropped a tin of hundreds of dominoes out onto a dining room table that she had, a massive dining room table, hundreds of them, and we started lining up dominoes. How many of you have ever lined up dominoes? Have you ever done this, lined up dominoes? And it takes a while, but finally, we got these hundreds of dominoes. Every one of them is in place on her massive table, and I'm ready. I'm poised and ready. I can't wait. When she put her hand on my arm and pulled my arm back and said, "Grandson, wait a minute. Before you do what you're about to do, I want you to pretend, grandson, that you are so small." Now, this was before the Disney movie, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, so she's way ahead of her time. She said, "I want you to pretend you're so small. All you can see is one. It looks like just one. But grandson, never forget, when you impact that one just right, it'll impact another. That will impact another. That will impact another. You don't have to worry about number 13 or 57 or 109 or 543. You worry about the one that's in front of you and watch the domino ripple effect take place." Time and again, they would watch Jesus focus on one life. Matthew tells you that he noticed that even in Jesus' hometown, there were 4 dudes that brought one guy to Jesus, and Jesus looks at him, impacts that life, and by the time you get to Matthew 9:8, Matthew tells you that there were all kinds of people who are being domino ripple affected. And then Matthew, who's the accountant, who keeps track of details, noticed that it wasn't just that Jesus modeled an up-close, mainstream, one life at a time plan, but he had methods. What were his methods? Were they doable by people like us? And Matthew wants you to know, oh, yeah, highly doable, but a lot of people don't do these things that would lead to high impact living. So Matthew wanted us to know first that the one method he noticed a lot was that Jesus would see people. His method was to see people. Put your hands in front of your eyes right now. We're all going to do this. Put them in front of your eyes. And when I count to 3, just say the word see and pull them away. 1, 2, 3. See. Let's do it one more time because you're going to need this all week long. Jesus taught them that it was very important to 1, 2, 3, see. And Matthew would tell you that was a huge deal. My son was going to a new school, and after a number of weeks had gone by, I asked my son, how's it going at your new school, Dad? He said, "Dad, I'm invisible." I said, "What?" He said, "Dad, I'm invisible." I thought, oh no, like he's watched too many superhero flicks and he thinks he's Invisiman now, so he's going to get hurt. I need to let him know. I need to be a responsible dad. Son, look at me. Look at me, son. You're not invisible. I see you. He said, Dad, I know you see me, but at my new school, when I go out for recess, they're looking for each other and they call out each other's names and they all run past me, Dad. Nobody sees me. And then I go in the cafeteria, Dad, and I get my tray and I sit down and I just wait and they're all looking for each other. They know each other. Dad, nobody sees me. And after school, I wait 13 minutes, Dad, for Mom to get my sister and everybody's walking all around me, Dad. And there's some bump into me and they'll say, excuse me, but they don't see me, Dad. I'm invisible. I'm invisible. At this point, my son's heart is breaking. And my father's heart's breaking too. Do you know how many people feel that way every day? Every day. And a Father God who knows them, who loves them, his heart is breaking. Will you see them? Matthew wants you to know that's how he felt. He was overlooked and undervalued by many people who actually despised him. They didn't even like him because of his vocation, so they just referred to him as the tax collector. He was despised because he was a co-conspirator with the oppressive Roman government, but he was a person. Underneath that caption and that title, he was a person. And he wants you to know that as Jesus went on from there, and this is a big deal, as Jesus went on from there, that just simply means that you don't see just when you have it scheduled. It's as your feet are moving, you see. It would be like you going from Walmart over to Target because Walmart didn't have something you needed, and you got one more stop at King Super, and will you see as you're going on from there? Matthew wants you to know Jesus did. People didn't feel invisible around Jesus. He would see them. And on this day, he wants you to know that as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man. How big a deal was that for Matthew? It was so huge. Do you know there's an African tribe, when one is walking down the street, they will say, I see you. And the other tribesmen walking toward him will say, I am here. And it's the gift of presence. I had a New Yorker man who was attending a Plan A conference, and he said, you're trying to get us over tuckhead. I said, I'm sorry, what? He said, tuckhead. You want us to stop doing tuckhead. I said, I don't even know what you're talking about. What is tuckhead? He said, that's what we do, out east. Somebody's walking down the street and we see him at a distance. We tuck our head down and we keep walking because we don't want to feel any social responsibility. He said, you want us to stop doing tuckhead and see. And I said, yeah, because Matthew wants us to know it was a method of Jesus. He would see people other people weren't seeing. Whether they were up a tree or at a well that nobody else was there, he would just continue to see one person after another. It was a big deal. Matthew tells you that not only was his method to see, but his other method was to stop. Put your hands up like we're going to be patrol guards and we're going to stop all the traffic and save the kindergarten children. Come on. Yeah, this was Jesus' position. They would notice a lot of times they think they're going somewhere and then he'd stop. What was that? Because he recognized when he would see someone that they needed stopped with long enough to, what's your name? Oh, I'm the tax collector. No, what's your name? Matthew? Well, hello, Matthew. Dale Carnegie, who wrote one of the most powerful books, translated all over the world, that was called How to Influence People. And this is our influencer series here at the church. He said the most valuable, important thing you can ever do is learn someone's name and speak their name. And when you speak their name, not their category of service, that's the waiter, that's the mechanic, that's the teacher, that's the coach, but you speak their name in their presence, it is like a gift. It's often the beginning of a relationship because they feel more seen when you stop and learn their name. You might be thinking, but I don't know them and I don't need to know them. Remember a little Jewish German man who was attending a Plan A conference and he was a little frustrated. It was very clear. You could read his body language all too clear. And we got to break time and he came up to me and he said, I tell you, I no like this talk to strangers. We no talk to strangers. They're strangers. And he looked around at all the people, and he'd seen them really being familiar and comfortable with each other. And he said, and I know like this huggy stuff, this huggy, and talk to strangers. Well, he left for break, and I thought maybe he wasn't going to come back. But I noticed at the end of break, he's back, and I went over to him, and I said, how you doing? He said, I went for a walk. I said, you did? He said, I talk with God. I talk with God. What did you say to God? I tell him, I know like this huggy, and all these strangers. I said, did you feel like God conveyed anything to you? Yes, he did. That's why I am back. He tell me, he no make any strangers. They're no strangers to him. He is just waiting for me to get to know them. There are invisible people all around us. And God, our Father, knows them. His heart is breaking. Will we see? And will we stop? She's been your checkout clerk before at the store. Do you see her? Will you stop long enough to see she's actually wearing a name right there? Will you call out her name? Hello, Ashley. How are things in your world today? She's startled because nobody's called her by name all day. She's invisible. After all, she's just the cashier. But now she looks up at you and you say, how are things going in your world today? And you look like you seriously would care. And she says to you, it's funny you should ask. I got 2 sick kids at home and I'm worried to death. Every break I get, I'm calling to check on them. I wish I could be there with them, but I'm a single mom and I don't have a choice. I'm the breadwinner of the family. I have to be here today. And imagine you see and you stop now and you say, Ashley, I know we got people behind us. I just want you to know I'm going to be praying for you and your kids. You think that's not a big deal, but you go out to the parking lot and you're sitting there in your parking spot and you pause and you pray for Ashley. How many of you would say you're where you're at today because somebody, you're a praying grandma or a family member or a friend? How many of you would say you're where you're at today because somebody prayed for you? You'd say, yeah, somebody prayed for me and that's made all the difference for me. So there you are in the parking lot praying Ashley's name. And then 2 hours later, somebody else who was in second service at High Point actually is in Ashley's line 2 hours later, and you see and stop and you see her name and you call out her name. Hey, Ashley, how are you doing today? And she looks up like you're the second person who's seen her, and you call her by name, and it's feeling a little strange to her because nobody sees her all day long. She feels more like a function than a person. And she said, well, that's funny. Somebody asked me 2 hours ago, and I told them I got sick kids at home I'm really worried about. And you say, Ashley, I'll be praying for you and your kids when I get in my car. And you sit in your parking spot and you pray. Do you know what Jesus told his disciples? Matthew tells us what he told his disciples in Matthew 18:19. He said, if any two will agree on anything and ask it in my name, I will do it and it'll be done. Do you know what just happened for Ashley and her kids when 2 of us began to see and stop and do the thing? How many of you believe prayer changes things? Yes, absolutely. And we do what changes things. That's what kingdom laborers do. Kingdom laborers don't only love God and love others, they get things done. And prayer is one of the most powerful things you and I get things done. But there was one other thing that Matthew let us in on. And that was that Jesus' method was to see, stop, and even spend time with. That was such an experience for Matthew when he tells you that as Jesus was having dinner, spending time at Matthew's house with many tax collectors and sinners that came to eat with him, profound things were happening at the table. At the table. You thought this was the place of ministry? And Jesus validated all kinds of mainstream locations, including lots of tables he sat at with people up close. When you sit at a meal table up close with somebody, you're sitting closer than you would actually sit in a family room or a living room with them. You are doing the Jesus thing. Remember, he taught up close. You're up close. But guess what? When you're up close, when your feet are pulled up to the table with somebody you're taking lunch with or break with, and you get 365 days a year to have options. Some of you, we eat 3 meals a day. Come on. How many of you love to eat like me? Hands up. You love to eat? Look at you. You got great ministry potential. Because it's at tables or over beverages where we get past, hi, how are you? I'm fine. We get past that to we share our stories. We share our ideas so much that they tell us that the best ideas of the entire world were first written on, do you know what? On table napkins. In fact, last week I pulled the napkin off my flight from Southwest. It says in 1971, a triangle scribbled on a napkin transformed a dream into an airline. 3 dots, 3 cities. That's how Southwest started, 2 people sitting at a table. But Jesus would have you know, when he sat at Matthew's table, he was up close. You know what we teach our children in this area at High Point? We teach them Jesus lives in your, where does Jesus live? He lives in your heart. We base that on 1 Corinthians 3:16 that says, don't you know that you're the temple of God's Spirit? He lives within you. So can I tell you who's at the table with them? The one who lives in you. He's pulled up to them, exactly where he wants to be in the mainstreams, at a meal table with them. It was another guy that we're told about by Luke who kept accounts, and he tells you that this guy was short and rich, a little Danny DeVito type, you know. He's so short that when Jesus is just, his feet are moving through his town, he's heard about him and he wants to see, but he can't see over the tall people. So he climbs up in a tree, and he gets up in the tree, and Jesus, because he just doesn't walk without his eyes open, Jesus sees him up in a tree, and he must have turned to these guys, and Matthew goes, oh, I know him. He's a boss man. He's a chief tax collector. That guy's Zacchaeus. And Jesus looks up and stops and says, hey, Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus must have been like, he knows my name. And Jesus said, he knows your name. He knows all our names. And Jesus said, hey, Zacchaeus, let's go spend time at your house. He went to Zacchaeus' house. Over and over again, he would model for them. They came once from getting supplies in a town, and he is sitting, now it's not a meal table, he's just sitting at a beverage stop where lots of people were often gathered, but on this day there was just one woman who was used to nobody seeing her. And he stopped and began to spend time asking her questions. She was from a different ethnic origin than him, and over non-bottled spring water. He told this woman all kinds of stuff she'd never heard, because over a beverage, you've got a little bit of time you can spend. And her heart got so lit on fire, and her life so on purpose, that suddenly you had one domino life, but it's never just one. It's never just one. Who went tearing off into her village to tell other people what had just transpired because someone saw, stopped, and spent time with her. My son, 2 weeks later, after we'd had that mainstream conversation, said, Dad, Tommy gave his life to Jesus in the cafeteria today. I said, what? He said, Dad, it was so cool. He said, Dad, I got my tray and I turned the corner, and Dad, I could see him. Dad, he was sitting all by himself. So I walked over, Dad, with my tray, and what? Come on, you guys. He did what? He stopped, and he said, Tommy, you want somebody to sit with you? Dad, he did. So I sat down, Dad, and I spent time with. Come on, let's make sure you know these things. If we're Jesus followers, we want to do what? At the count of 3, come on, we're going to do this together. We're all going to look ridiculous together. We can do this. If we're Jesus followers, we're going to what? 1, 2, 3. We're going to see, stop, and spend time with. Dad, he said, while we were spending time talking about all our favorite stuff, eventually we were on Christmas, and we were talking about what we hope for, and then I told him about the nativity, and he said, what's that? And he didn't know, Dad, and so I told him Jesus was born, but then Jesus lived to show us how to live, and then he died so that we could have a relationship with God the Father through Jesus, and I told him, and so he lives in me, and Tommy said, I don't understand, and so I explained, and I said, Tommy, do you want Jesus to live in you? And he did, so I prayed with him, Dad, and we got to get him a Bible. They don't have a Bible at their house, Dad. Can I ask you a question? How many of you would say my grade school son was a kingdom labor influence like we've been talking about here? How many of you believe he was a kingdom labor? You do. Come on, some of us have disqualified ourselves. You need to understand something. You don't have to have a high school diploma. You don't have to have a fancy degree. A grade schooler. I was on the receiving end of this when a roofer had just fixed our roof. A rugged-looking guy crawls off the roof, and he's standing in my home now with a piece of paper, and he said, sir, I've adjusted your bill. Any of you love that when they adjust your bill? You know, it usually goes one direction. And I said, I'm sorry, can I see that? And as he put it in front of me, he said, sir, you'll notice it's half of what I originally told you. I said, what? Half? He said, yeah, because it only took me half the time and half the materials. And sir, that feels to me the fair price. And listen, if it ever gives you trouble, you call me and I'll be back for free. I guarantee my work. Now I really like this guy, so I go to get my checkbook and I'm going to write it for the original amount plus a tip. And as I come back in, this rugged roofer's standing there waiting. And I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, James, I remember when you just answered the phone. Hello, I'm James the roofer. And I didn't know who you were, but man, the way you just transacted business with me today, man, I just want you to know we're so thankful that we found you. We needed the help you provided. And I patted him on the shoulder and said, you're running a great business, James. But he took a step back from me and said, sir, I cannot accept your compliment. I thought that was so weird. And I said, I'm sorry. He said, no, do you have just a minute, sir? He said to me. I said, yeah, I got a minute. He said, well, sir, 13 years ago, you would not have wanted me near your house. You wouldn't have wanted me near your wife or children, who I've been hearing in the background. I was strung out on drugs. My life was a mess, and you wouldn't have trusted me at all. But then, sir, and I don't know you, he said to me, but I'm going to try to explain something to you the best I know how as a roofer. There's a creator God who made the entire universe, sir. And he had a son, and his name was Jesus. And from the love of the creator God, he sent his son, Jesus, to come and live and show us how to live, but also to die for your sins, sir. He's pointing to me and my sins. And so that what he did to die a cruel death on a cross would pay our sin bill in full. And we could have a relationship with God made possible through his son, Jesus. And he said, when somebody explained that to me 13 years ago, I couldn't wait to make that decision. Like that was a no-brainer. So, sir, I really appreciate your compliment, but I really couldn't accept it until I could tell you that I am who I am. And then he raised his rugged, weathered hand and he said, because of him, sir. Whew. I looked at this roofer. And then I realized he didn't know. And I said, hey, brother. He said, what? I said, brother. He said, you're one? And I said, well, you don't need to act so surprised. Yeah, I'm one. He said, no, if you are already one, what am I doing at your house? I pray every day that God will send me to customers where they don't know the love of God and they've never heard what I just shared with you. But if you already are one, why am I at your house? He's almost frustrated. He's a kingdom laborer on the job 24/7. And I said, well, I don't know. By this time, my wife and kids were in the room. And I said, James, maybe you're at our house because we would love, oh man, to think that there's a roofer moving all over our city like you. Man, I'm so fired up. There should be in every vocation, every person, like, it's so cool. Could we pray for you and your ministry? He said, well, what would that look like? And I said, it'd just be you standing right here and we'd just like to pray for you. He wasn't comfortable or acquainted with what we were doing, but he said, yeah, I need prayer, man. I'm doing this every day and sometimes it's really hard. So this rugged roofer stood there and folded his hands and then remembered he had bandana on, took it off and shoved it in his pocket like, okay, whatever you guys do, do it. And we just simply circled him as a little family of four and put our hands on this rugged roofer and prayed for him and his ministry. Every day, everywhere he goes. My heart was so moved to think about this roofer and what he'd done with me and how many homes is he going to do this in. And as we were praying, my son pulled in my arm like, Dad, are you realizing what's happening? And I was, because my hand was on his back and this rugged roofer was sobbing uncontrollably. When we finished praying, he turned around, his back to my family and said, sir, I'm so sorry I lost it like that in front of your family. But sir, as he was pulling his bandana out, trying to get his composure, I've been doing this 13 years and no one has ever validated my ministry before today. Where did we lose track of Jesus' plan? That common people in common places who could live out his plan every day, everywhere, advancing the kingdom. That's believed here. And I don't know if you've pronounced something over yourself that he wouldn't pronounce, sort of like Peter who said, you might not want to be around me, I'm a sinner. I don't know where you are in your life, but Jesus would look at you and say, why don't you spend time with me and get eyes on, and I'll show you. You don't have to wish and hope that you could lead a high impact life. I'll show you how to live it. And we learn from him that it was as simple as up close in the mainstreams where you already are. One life at a time, taking the time to see stop and spend time with. They're everywhere. Like Ashley, the cashier, who, when 2 people prayed from this church, her life was impacted. How many other people are waiting for that impact? High Point Church. And you are God's plan A. He doesn't have a plan B. You're it. He never has looked for perfect people. He chooses and uses as his first round draft pick imperfect people. Hey, I'm Dwight the Fright. I'm here to tell you, if he can use me, he can use anybody. Our church believes, and our pastor believes so much in Ephesians 4 that teaches that these people who have such extraordinary talents and gifts, that God has gifted them to equip God's people. And we don't belong to the enemy, we belong to God, to equip God's people for everyday kingdom laborship every day. We can live lives of meaning and purpose. I would tell you that it's very important for us to choose and decide. There was a choice for Peter that day. Why don't you come follow me? And immediately, it says, immediately he did. All across this room, across the auditorium, I'm just going to challenge you, whether you've been a kingdom laborer up to now, but you're re-upping. You're re-upping. Or whether you've never before, but you would say, this is the life I want to live. You may be older in life and you'd think, I'm kind of done with my years, but Scripture tells us, Psalm 92, you will bear fruit in old age. God promises that. Your best years of high impact may be now. Some of us as men, many of these men would have disqualified themselves, but Jesus said, come on, I'll show you how. Stop. Let him. Fix your eyes on him. It's an incredible life. I'm Dwight the Fright, and I would ask you, do I look miserable? I'm not. Welcome to the joy of kingdom laborship.